So, Peter.
Thank you, Rod. I look forward to listening to my inimitable style, Rod. Thank you for that. I'm not sure what that is. Good morning, everybody. This morning, we're looking at Exodus chapter 16 that Judith read so well to us, and the theme is provision. I never feel that the messages that we give are meant to just be a collection of words. My own understanding is that these messages are to help us to work out what it means to be a follower of Jesus in real life situations. So I want to begin by taking the liberty of sharing you two true experiences of mine. In 2001, I was diagnosed with left ventricular failure in the heart. I also had acute and chronic back pain and a very serious clinical depression. It was due to those three things that eventually I had to take early retirement. My GP was excellent, and he told me that I should go and see a consultant psychiatrist from Bolton at a place called the Priory Clinic in Preston. And for that privilege, I'd pay about 150 quid, but he would be really helpful, my GP assured me. I did see the psychiatrist, who said to me that I was very seriously ill with depression and I needed to be admitted to the Priory Clinic in Preston immediately. For those who don't know the Priory, it's where the TV stars and local celebrities go. So with my inimitable style, probably it was a good place to go. I asked the psychiatrist what the cost would be, and he said a staggering £2,500 per week. Now, Linda and I didn't have that kind of money, and we decided that we'd still go ahead and that I would go in the Priory and we'd remortgage a house that at the time we owned. After 3 weeks in the Priory, I was discharged at a cost of £7,500, which we didn't have. Sadly, the remortgage of the house didn't work out, and we had to work out other ways, and I was panicking a little bit. However, two Christian friends had been given a lump sum of money, and they believed that God was telling them to help us. And I can remember the day when they came over to our house with an envelope stuffed with money, and in it was £1,000 towards the cost of the Priory. But that still left 6,500. I also, at the time, I don't now, but I used to at the time, use a NatWest credit card, and I'd taken out payment protection. And I thought that NatWest might be able to help in some way. So I made an application. And to my surprise, I got a check from NatWest for 3,500. So that meant I had 4,500 available cash, but I still had £3,000 to find, which we still didn't have. Somebody told me about a charity in London that would look sympathetically on my situation. So I wrote to them. Sadly, they replied and said, "We're very sorry, but it's outside our terms of reference, and on this occasion, we can't help you." But whilst I was in the Priory, I received a cheque from the charity in London for £3,000. And even though it wasn't in their terms of reference, they said that their committee had met and were so moved by my plight that they paid up anyway. Now, in my reckoning, that's £7,500 paid in full without having to do any remortgage. I find that astounding and definitely not coincidence. Move forwards several years later. And due to a crash in house prices, and also the spirit of continental holidays hovering heavily upon us, such as Austria and other places, we were £30,000 in debt. We've never been good at selling things, and so we lost £40,000 on the sale of the house that we owned. But I did remember God's provision in 2001. And I looked back and remembered how he provided that money. So I wondered if a millionaire might send us a check. I did know at least a couple of millionaires. I always feel it's a good thing to know at least one millionaire. But a millionaire didn't send a check. A Christian businessman friend of mine did pay a credit card bill for $1,200, which paid off that little bit of debt. And I was so grateful, but I still had $29,000 to find. In the end, it wasn't a millionaire. It wasn't a Christian businessman. In the end, it was us. We had to pay off the debt. There were no shortcuts. And I'm pleased to say that that debt was fully paid eventually. So you see, looking back over the past and God's provision, God provided miraculously $7,500. He also enabled us to pay off a £30,000 debt years later. So do I now trust God for everything? Do I look back and say, well, God did it then, so I know he'll do it now? And the answer is, sadly, no. I don't trust him as I should do. I'm a bit like the people of Israel in that story in Exodus chapter 16. Despite knowing God's provision in the past, I still sometimes struggle. I just want to mention something about the way God works. After 58 years as a Christian, I can tell you that God has laws in place. And one of those laws is a verse in the Bible that says you reap what you sow. And I've discovered in my life that if you are miserly, you will reap miserly. If you are generous, you will reap generosity. Jesus said, give, 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 and expect no reward. And I've always said, you cannot outgive God. So let's go back to Exodus 16. Israel wanted out of slavery in Egypt. And we've seen over the last few weeks how God worked miracles and how the people of Egypt and Pharaoh eventually told the people of Israel, we want you out of Egypt. But now they're 1 month in a journey. They're in a barren desert. And surprise, surprise, they're complaining to Moses and Aaron, the leaders, that they're fearful of having no food. We read in verse 4, God said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven. That's even more staggering than Peter Kay's garlic bread. God says, I will rain down bread from heaven. Who'd have thought that? Now, I've often said that the Old Testament is a shadow of the New Testament. What we see in the Old is a shadow of something that we're going to see in the New. And in the New, in St. John's Gospel, chapter 6, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And then in another verse, I am the bread that came down from heaven. You see, these verses in Exodus 16 are a shadow of Jesus who was to come. Jesus came down from heaven like the manna. He gives spiritual life, just as the manna gave physical life. He is the only hope of eternal life, just like the manna was the only hope of sustaining the people of Israel. Jesus is for all people. The manna was for all Israel, God's people. So in verse 4, The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day, one day at a time. Don't go out with little carts and buckets and collect it for a week. You'll see why in a moment. God gave Israel 3 rules for the manna, and these rules were meant for their good. Firstly, only one day's portion at a time, and the same amount for each person. And God didn't drop the manna into their mouths. They had to go out and gather what they needed each day. So they cooperated with God. Obedience plays a big part in God's provision. Secondly, gather only in the morning and none on the 7th day. You see, the provision of bread from heaven came with the responsibility of obedience. How responsible Israel were would test and measure their obedience. You see, the test was on the 6th day. They were to gather twice as much so that the 7th day could be a day of rest. So God supernaturally provided for the people of Israel in the desert. In the evening, God provided meat in the form of little quail birds. And in the morning, bread in the form of manna. And Israel was sustained in the wilderness. So the people of Israel had much to look back on to see God's provision for them, just like I was able to look back and see God's provision for me. There were the plagues against the Egyptians, which eventually allowed the people of Israel to be set free. There was their deliverance through the Red Sea. Imagine that. The sea is parted and the people of Israel are able to get through and escape the Egyptians. Yet even these great experiences did not change their hearts as much as we might imagine. Sadly, Israel failed on each rule. They showed disobedience and unbelief. God had miraculously provided, yet Israel failed to follow his simple rules. And it wasn't just a natural phenomenon that happened. The manna fed approximately 2 million people. That's quite a miracle on God's part. And God provided this food after his promise to Moses. And it continued whilst they were in the desert wilderness, which was around 40 years. And the manna disappeared once the people were through the wilderness. So it definitely wasn't just nature taking its course. It was God providing for his people. If the people broke God's rules and hoarded the manna, they found that it was full of maggots and had an awful smell. So despite God's mercy and goodness to the people of Israel, they still complained to Moses and Aaron, their leaders. Do you know there's a whole book in the Bible written about that? It's called the Book of Numbers, but I prefer to call it the Book of Grumblers because it's just full of the people of Israel grumbling against their leaders. So even then, God still continues to show them his mercy. You'd think God might get fed up and say, look, you lot, I've done all this for you, and yet this is how you repay me. But he doesn't. He continues to show mercy. And you know what? God continues to show mercy to us today. He does not give us what we deserve. It's called grace, the undeserved free gift of a loving God. He reaches out because he loves us. And the purpose of God sending the people of Israel this bread from heaven was not just to feed them, but it was to teach them to depend on God. I want to ask you a question at this point and just to ponder. Is God trying to teach us to depend upon him through things that happen in our lives? Today, I believe that this account in Exodus 16 has much to teach us. St. John in his Gospel in the New Testament, again in chapter 6, Jesus says this, "Most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." You see, Jesus is the bread from heaven for us today. We have to receive him, just like the people of Israel received the manna. To do this, we need to be aware of our need. We need to come to him, hungry and thirsty, spiritually, for him. We can't receive Jesus for others. It's our personal relationship with him that counts. It's no good saying, "Oh, all my family are Christians, therefore I must be a Christian," any more than you can be in a greenhouse and say, "I'm a tomato." Just like the people of Israel had to receive the manna, each one of them, so we need to receive him. And it's a daily walk with Jesus. It's a journey. I mentioned earlier, in my case, it's 58 years of a journey. Have I been faithful to God? Lots of times I've goofed it. I failed him. I've let him down. Do I give up? No, I press on. It's a journey. The people of Israel possibly had to kneel down to get the manna because it was littering the floor. And it's a reminder that we need to come humbly to Jesus. We need to come with gratitude, knowing we don't deserve it. And especially at Holy Communion, spiritually, we partake of all that Jesus has done for us on the cross and reach out to him. So I want to conclude, as we look back at God's provision, even if he hasn't sent you £7,500 to pay a hospital bill, think about it. Jesus lovingly died on the cross for me and for you. Are we seeking to trust and depend upon him who gave his everything for us? Amen.